I'm going to be focusing on giving you a tour of my minimalist Obsidian setup in 2 parts to answer questions that a lot of people brought up on the last video and then other questions that my colleagues have had. In the first part, I'm going to be talking about just my personal knowledge management system and my workflow with it as a PhD student, which will just show you why I have the vault organized the way I do. And then in part 2, I'm going to talk more about the aesthetics of my vault because I've gotten a lot of questions about like, what theme do you use and like, how did you make it look like this? I'm going to focus on that in the second part. There are a lot of personal knowledge management or like PKM systems out there. I think the most famous one is Zettelkasten, and my PhD advisor is like super into it, and he encouraged me to read the book How to Take Smart Notes to get me going in that direction because I've always been super into like color coding and making it easier to find information again. Zettelkasten, as it was originally used by Carl Linnaeus, who used the system to research and write tons of books and articles, was made up of a large collection of index cards that were meant to be connected to each other. Zettelkasten literally translated into English just means slip box, referring to like the actual physical box where Linnaeus held all of his note cards. One major premise of this system is that an idea has to be able to fit onto a single note card, which is where we get this idea of atomic notes or ideas. You break down concepts into their very fundamental component parts and you write each part on a single note card, and then you connect them all together using some sort of like key or referencing like the number of the other note cards. So you could say you have a note card that is just like note card 1, note card 2, and you don't really need to have like a system for the numbering, and then you can just reference the number of that note card on the other note cards and they create this network. For this system, the atomic note is kind of doing most of the heavy lifting for this, and it also falls under a secondary category of permanent notes. In the Zettelkasten method, there are different types of notes. There are fleeting and there are permanent notes, and then under each of those categories there are literature or source notes and then index or structure notes. And there are different varieties of Zettelkasten methods out there, so you might find other types of notes as well, like what some call project notes. Fleeting notes are quick ideas that you just want to jot down and then flesh out later. So you put them in a spot and then have a dedicated time to come back to them and get them to a place where you feel good filing them away as they are. At that point, they become permanent notes. Permanent notes are the ones that you do have filed away. They are good to go and you can reference them later as they are. These are primarily what I call atomic notes in my vault, but I don't really use Zettelkasten super strictly, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the other kinds of notes are literature or source notes, and these are things like quotes or ideas that you're directly pulling from something that you have read or watched. In my last video on Zotero and Obsidian, the entire workflow was based on being able to automatically pull my annotations from Zotero into Obsidian, and all of those annotations go onto what is called a source note, which is all of the information that I got from a source. Again, you could create these to be atomic, but for me, I just have like everything on the source in the one single note. Again, that's how I kind of differ from like strict Zettelkasten. And then structure notes just show which notes are connected to which. So if you had a physical Zettelkasten, you probably would have some index cards that say like, oh, for this topic, all of these things are connected together. They're not really needed in Obsidian because Obsidian does the connecting for you. As long as you type in the note, then it gets connected and they're all linked together automatically. You could think of the graph as a type of structure note because it shows you all of those different connections, and then you can also look at that from like the huge view, zoomed out view of your entire vault, or you can look on the more local level at these different graphs. Finally, project notes are kind of like a structure note, but they are focused more on specific projects. So I use the canvas for this, where I can embed atomic notes and draw arrows between them and then add text boxes for connecting sentences and so on. But another type of project note that I know academics use even like outside of like a strict Zettelkasten method is annotated bibliographies, or even just like a bibliography for a project. As you're doing research and like reading all the literature, to do the literature review part of a project, you collect all of these sources, and it's really helpful to just have all of those sources listed on a document that you can come back to and make sure that like, okay, did I read all these things? Because a lot of times you'll have like, okay, I am compiling this bibliography, but maybe I haven't read all of these yet. So you can like create a checklist on that bibliography to keep track of what you've read and what you haven't read, and making sure you get to all of the literature surrounding the topic that you're talking about. So as I mentioned, I am not using Zettelkasten strictly. I definitely intended to start out that way, but I don't personally really do fleeting notes. I view my vault as one giant living document, like a brain, and I've also heard some other people who use Obsidian on the internet, they treat it like a a garden. I like that analogy of thinking of it as a garden because I'm constantly going back to atomic notes and like adding things to them and linking other things. So if I start off with an atomic note called, for instance, the evolution of the Disney princess, since my research is in Disney music, and I start out with it primarily being about one author's take on the Disney princess, I will probably have other things to add to this after I've read other things. So I think of these atomic notes as constantly evolving. So that's why I don't really like that distinction between fleeting and permanent notes. And it also takes the pressure off of having perfect atomic notes for me, because when I first started out, I had a lot of issues with being like, oh no, if I make this permanent, then it has to be perfect. So then I would procrastinate it or fret over a single atomic note that no one else is going to read but me. And then the other thing is I don't treat my atomic notes as atomic. I should probably rename them, but I like having that folder at the top of my folder list because it starts with A, so I'm gonna leave it as atomic for now. But the way I think of my atomic notes is like Wikipedia pages, where you have this like big idea and then you can start filling it out, and then as it grows, you maybe realize like, oh, this section's really long, it can be its own Wikipedia article. So then you can like cut and paste that and turn it into its own atomic note. I don't really have any hard and fast rules for that. Because I've read so many Wikipedia articles over the years, you kind of get a feel for how long it should be, and it's something that you just kind of have to play with until you find some happy medium that just feels right for you. So I'm really going off of vibes for this, which I know is not the best answer for a lot of people, or maybe not the answer you're looking for, but a big part of creating a personal knowledge management system is experimenting, because your brain works differently than everyone else's brain. So taking a look at my actual vault, you'll see it is very minimalistic, and that is intentional. I only have 4 folders in here. They're named atomic notes, projects, source notes, and templates. So again, like atomic notes are the notes I was just talking about. They're just like random ideas based on things that I've read and things that I'm learning about. Projects folder is for bibliographies and canvases where I brainstorm papers and projects. I use these spaces to embed atomic notes or parts of atomic notes, connect them with arrows and outline papers. So I have one on this Disney qualifying paper I'm doing. So I started out by like thinking that all of the literature I was going to read was going to fit into these like neat and tidy categories. So I tried to like force them to do that. That actually sort of helped, but not really. So then I moved on to this other structure where I kind of had like mini annotated bibliographies that are like, okay, so there were people talking about non-musical topics. There's the idea of appropriation and censorship and all of these other things just like going on, where the categories for this started to emerge as I was reading more. It's very messy, and that's kind of the goal for these, is like, this is the place where you can be messy. Back when I did use physical note cards for papers, because my like K through 12 private school had us use like a note card method for this, I would just be like on my bedroom floor throwing note cards everywhere, and it just looked like chaos. And like, I didn't have the yarn, but I did draw a map on a piece of paper of like, okay, this bunch on the left side of the room points to this, and this is a digital attempt at that. And I haven't refined it yet, but I think it's a very helpful way of organizing that. And then I also tried to make like an annotated bibliography, and then I ended up brainstorming at the top of this and have like a working outline. And my paper is not anything like this anymore, because as I wrote, the structure changed. But I do have bibliography here, and then I have things, little highlighted things saying to read, which I have read these by now actually, but I didn't go back and change them because I kind of abandoned this. So it's a work in progress of understanding like how my brain works. Source notes is like the main topic of my previous Obsidian and Zotero video, where all my literature notes live. These are pretty much all imports from Zotero. This top one is all the images from these, and I'm probably gonna add another like level of file structure hierarchy so that this is just like one folder with all of these inside it. So I haven't done that yet. I need to get to it. But you'll see I have all of these sources here where you literally just end up with my highlights and annotations from different sources. And then what I do, and I'll talk more about this and like talk about my workflow a little bit more in a minute. These are all basically imports from Zotero or notes that I took on other sources that I didn't have like PDFs for. And then finally, the templates folder folders there just because I needed templates for my workflow. I only open this folder to create or edit existing templates, but otherwise it's just a background type of folder. And then for those wondering, I'm going to come back to this later, but I'm using the Iconize plugin to add icons to the front of these folder names. But again, more on aesthetics in part 2. So workflow wise, I start from literature. So since I'm doing a PhD right now and I'm currently working on qualifying papers for my program are literature reviews. So the bulk of that is just reading literature and then synthesizing it. So I start by reading in Zotero usually. And in my previous video, which I will link somehow if you're watching this, at least on YouTube, shows you how to set up that Zotero integration. But I generally will highlight and comment on a PDF version of the source. And my highlight colors are the traffic light method plus some of my own, where green means that the author is making a super strong point that is relevant to something that I'm doing or arguing. And these are usually quotes that I will want to quote exactly in my paper. Yellow is for points that are important to the author's argument, but they may not be exactly what I'm doing, but they're just like really important for context. So I don't want to forget what they said, but I don't necessarily need to quote it exactly. Red is for claims that I completely disagree with or know that have been debunked. So if I'm reading like a really old piece of literature from like 200 years ago and they say something like, everyone knows that this is true, and then we actually know that it's not true, I highlight it in red and like will literally say like, oh, we know it's not true because of these sources or these studies, or say that I disagree because of blah, blah, blah. Aside from the traffic light method, I have 3 other colors that I use. Purple is for heading, because once you import the highlights from Zotero, it's helpful to have those headings present as context for the things that I've highlighted. So knowing that like, oh, this thing happened in the introduction chapter, or this thing is part of a case study, is very helpful information to know as I'm just kind of like scrolling through my annotations. Blue is for like references to other sources. So when an author cites another author's work and it seems like something that I should read or want to look into later, I'll highlight it in blue to remind myself to add it to my to read list. And then also if there is a claim that an author makes that I know is connected somehow to a claim by another author, I'll also highlight that in blue and comment, this study says that too. And then finally, pink is my confused color. It's just for when I have questions about things or completely don't understand what the author is saying. And then if the author answers that question pages later or even like at the end of the book, I'll highlight that answer in pink as well and say like, leave a comment there that says, oh, that answers my question from page whatever. And if the author did not answer the question, I can see that later as I'm like scrolling through all of my annotations. And this works well for even for things as long as like giant books. So that's the first step of my workflow, which is just reading and annotating. And that is one of the longest steps because like you do a lot of reading in a PhD. Then I import the annotations into Obsidian and that automatically creates a new literature note. For sources where I either don't have a PDF of it or it's something like audio or video, I will actually import the source from Zotero first and then I'll manually take notes in the persistent notes part of my template. So for example, this note basically just lists out what Soundfield's YouTube video talks about as important parts of what makes a Disney song sound like Disney, since I'm interested in what is actually part of the Disney sound, and that's a big part of my literature review. From there, I will take that literature note and then pull out strong ideas that are important to me and my research. For example, this article by Ryan Bunch about tropes in Disney's Frozen has a lot of green in it, and the first one is about how Disney dominates the animated film musical. And since I want to study Disney music, part of my job is to explain why Disney music should be studied. So this first quote about how Disney dominates an important cultural medium helps support my larger argument that Disney, especially the animated musical, acts as a powerful vehicle for transmitting cultural beliefs. So what I would do then is make an atomic note saying just that, Disney acts as a powerful vehicle for transmitting cultural beliefs, and then I copy that quote there along with the link to the source note. And you'll see that how I'm still pretty new to Obsidian because I didn't actually do this yet despite writing this in my paper already. But learning and knowledge management are not linear, so I'm glad that I'm doing it now because long after I turn this paper in, I'm going to be able to come back to this atomic note and see all the sources without having to track down this paper that I wrote and then forgot about. So that's something I'm planning to do is like once the paper's done, I'm going to go back and like make more atomic notes on things that I didn't make atomic notes on yet. And ideally I would just like set aside a consistent time to do that, but I haven't yet. So the next highlight on this Bunch article is a quote about Frozen as a feminist Disney princess musical. musical. I have read a lot of literature arguing about whether Frozen counts as a feminist musical at all. So this quote then goes into a note that I chose to call Frozen as a Disney feminist musical. This note is a bit of a mess. I even wrote a note to myself at the top of it so that I would come back and clean it up when I have time. And you know, like if I don't end up having time, it's totally okay. But basically this note serves as a collection of the arguments made by different scholars about Frozen as a feminist musical. Then what I can do is look at all of them and ask, like, where do these sources overlap? Do they talk about the same things, or are there arguments about completely different parts of the film? Like, is one focusing on only the visual aspects and one is only focusing on the narrative aspects and that sort of thing? At the bottom of this note, you'll see that I was sort of drafting ideas because for me, part of the refining arguments process has to be done in writing. I just have to write in order for my brain to work. Some people can draw or just think, but for me, I have to write usually at least like 4 drafts before my arguments even make sense to me. So then I'll just write and write and write in these types of notes. And then the plan is to go back and clean them up so they read more like a Wikipedia page, so that when I come back to them in like 10 years and have forgotten everything about it, I'm able to deal with it. The mess is also kind of nice to come back to and remind myself that it truly does take a ton of drafts for things to make sense in the first place. So if it stays a mess, I'm becoming okay with that. But anyways, I added the bunch quote here at the top for now just to show you. And then what's helpful is that you can now see how Bunch connects to other scholars I've read through using the local graph, and then through this single idea of Disney as a feminist movie or not. To get to the local graph, you just click on open linked view on the notes menu. So then there are 7 other source notes that also connect to this idea and another atomic note. When it comes to writing and exploring ideas, being aware of these connections is super helpful and also makes things that seem irrelevant to you and maybe uninteresting, it can make them more relevant to you, and therefore you're just gonna like be more interested in it because you realize that like, oh wow, this is connected to something that I'm super interested in. So that's the process of turning literature notes into atomic notes. I will go through like the entire literature note and just pull out things that seem important to me. You will spend a lot of time doing that, but that's also part of the process of like writing a literature review, is pulling out ideas and seeing how you can put different scholars in conversation with each other and just getting a fuller picture of like what's going on in the topic that I'm interested in. What have people already said? Have they said the same thing? Do they agree? Do they disagree? And where do I fit into all of this? Going back to that like super messy graph of me just brainstorming what the first lit review was going to look like, you'll see that like this is massive. I'm so zoomed out that you can't see any of the words. But on the left was this like overarching structure that I thought all the literature would just fall under. I was completely wrong, and that's totally okay. This was actually also my first time using the graph for this sort of thing. So then I moved to the right and did a new graph based on more of what I read, where topics were just kind of emerging naturally. I basically had these buckets that were more like mini annotated bibliographies of categories of literature that I'd read. And that's where the first draft of the paper came from, which I wrote in Word. And it was pretty much all in bullet points because for some reason I can't write if it's like I'm writing a proper paragraph, but I can write a full paragraph if it's in bullet points, and then I'll go back and read it and I'm like, oh, that's a paragraph, and then I'll just delete the bullets. Something about that tricks my brain into actually writing, so maybe that'll help you too. And once that first draft was done, it very much needed reorganizing. That's something that I also ended up doing in Word as I was writing. I made headings for each thing that I wanted to talk about. So I don't have anything to show you for that first draft because it turned into the second draft as I was writing, but that is basically how I write. So as I worked on further drafts, I kept reading and making atomic notes because another PhD, I can't remember who said this, but someone recommended just writing the literature review while you're still reading. So I was still reading and making atomic notes as I continued to write new drafts, and I ended up like even just referencing the names of the atomic notes in my bullet points, and that was like super helpful. So that just means that the canvas for me was the very first brainstorming messy, ugly, horrible, but necessary step. And then everything from there on I did in Word. And I just prefer writing in a proper word processor with all of those formatting capabilities and stuff because I format as I go as well. And that saves me a lot of time at the end and it just feels more efficient to me. But then once the paper's done, again, I plan on going back and reading that paper and making sure that I create any atomic notes for ideas that may have come up while I was writing the paper that may not have made it into my vault yet. So that way I have a single place where I can look for ideas and sources resources rather than years down the road thinking. There was a source that I referenced in a paper years ago. What paper was that again? I don't know. And I've actually already done this and been able to find knowledge or sources like so much faster than in other contexts because I was able, like it was all just like in my vault. I was able to just like search for words that I know I would use to describe a topic, and I was able, like in the middle of a class discussion, I was just like able to bring it up and I was like, oh, this person said that. That was like the writing process, and I hope that's helpful to people. I'm not really sure what you'll find most helpful with these kinds of videos, so if you have other questions, like let me know. People just ask me to walk through more of like what my vault looks like. So if you have any more specific questions or just like confused, let me know, and I'm happy to make another video about these things because it is kind of fun to talk about organization. But then moving on to part 2, the other questions that I've been getting are more about the aesthetics of my vault. So 2 things that you need to know about me as we go into the aesthetics part of this video is that I love to make things pretty. I started coding when I was in like middle school on Neopets because I wanted to make my shop and profile page pretty. That's how I learned HTML and CSS. But I also hate clutter, so my setup is as minimalistic as I can possibly make it. I've had so many people in real life and then also in comments on the previous video telling me to use all of these different plugins, and while I do really appreciate suggestions and I always look into like the plugins people recommend, most of the time I just stick with like core Obsidian plus the ones required for the Zotero integration workflow. I'm sure I will probably add more over time, but I really want to avoid software bloat and to just like keep it simple because I don't want to overcomplicate something that's already like really crazy. So that's why I'm using the minimalist theme. It is super simple and it doesn't add a ton of like bloat, but I did choose to customize it, and I use the minimal theme settings by Capano for this, which also I think you need to have the style settings plugin by MG Myers also installed. So those two work together. Basically how that works is that you have the minimalist theme and then you can go to the settings page of the style settings plugin and you'll see that there are different groups of settings for minimal, which is my theme. So there's like minimal, and then there's minimal cards, and then minimal advanced settings. For basically all of the appearance stuff that I did in my vault, like colors and fonts, all you need is this first group, minimal. I went online and I found a color that I like a lot as a base and just like got the hex code for it. And then I put it into a color palette maker that gave me like 20 different shades of that same color that went like all the way to black and then all the way to white. Basically, I knew that I wanted a dark mode, so my primary background here is dark, and I just tried out different shades of this color until I got the right amount of contrast for my eyes that like I was able to see very well, but it also wasn't like so much contrast that it hurt my eyes. I know that this can be like super overwhelming because you can customize so many things using this plugin, but I only changed colors in the sections called interface colors, accent color, block quotes, and headings. Everything else seems to just kind of like rely on the colors that you put for those things. So if you wanted to like have a different color for every single thing on Obsidian, you could do that, but you also don't need to do that. And then also for headings, you can change the font size for each level of heading. And that's something that I got used to in like Notion. So those are the theme settings specifically. The other visual thing that folks have asked about are the icons in my folder structure. For that, I use the Iconize plugin by Florian Welke, I think is how you pronounce it. And that lets you add icons to literally anything in Obsidian. It is not a productivity and workflow thing, but you know, I like things to be pretty and I enjoy seeing icons for things. And then I already talked about the templater plugin by Silent Void a little bit in the last Obsidian video, but this one is a very helpful visual and workflow one. You can make different types of templates beyond just the Zotero integration one. Say for example that you write notes that are like people, like profiles of people. If you have like historical figures or something, or for a music one, you could be like, I have a profile for all of these different composers where it gives like the dates they lived, where they lived, what era they were from, or like what instruments they wrote for. So those types of like properties or metadata, you can create a template for all of that where you just can automatically click for that. I also just have an atomic notes template that's super simple because it literally just has the tags property. I did have other things in it originally based on like things people on the internet were like, you need to have this in every atomic note. And then I realized I wasn't using all of those properties, so I just deleted them because I wasn't using them. Make it simple. Could I just make a new note and manually put the tags property in every single time? Yeah, I totally could, but then you first have to make the property section and then add the tags property. So that's quite a few keystrokes that I could just save a lot of time by making a template for, even though it's like a very sparse template. And then one other visual thing that I use, you'll see that I have other plugins here, but I don't really use them yet. I want to learn how to use them, but I just haven't gotten to it yet. But the other visual thing that I use that some of y'all might like is the emoji shortcodes plugin. I like to use emojis when I write little notes to myself. So to get an emoji in Obsidian, instead of having to like type an emoji into Google and like copy and paste it from some website, now all I have to do is type a colon and then a search bar will pop up and then you just search for the name of the emoji and then you can add it in there. But that's everything. So I tried to address most of the non-Zotero related questions that I saw from the previous video. So I hope this helped. And of course, like, let me know if you have other questions or other things you want to know that I could probably help with Obsidian or Zotero, or like being a PhD, organizing research, that sort of thing. And thanks again for all of the support on the other video. Bye!